Greetings and salutations. Today, we'll be discussing the life of Kurt Chew-Een Lee. Kurt was the first Asian American to be commissioned as an officer in the United States Marine Corp. His time in service was from April 10, 1944 to December 31st, 1966. He was a California boy. He was born in San Francisco, California, and that's where he spent the entirety of his life, was that area of San Francisco. His father was born in Hawaii, but he moved to the mainland when he was about 14, and he was very active in his Chinese community. He was part of an arranged marriage, which he honored, and went back to China to get married and go through all the fun stuff that comes with an arranged marriage. His father was also a big political fundraiser for Sun Yat-sen, who was the former president of the Republic of China. His father had 7 kids, and Lee was the oldest male of all of them. Well, the oldest period, and he was the firstborn male. There was 4 boys and 3 girls, and they all attended public school, and then they would go to Chinese cultural education school afterwards, essentially learning Chinese culture and the Chinese language. So that would take place. So he'd get home from school about 3:30, eat, and then he would walk to this Chinese cultural school, and that would be done at about 9 o'clock. So a full day of school, and then school on Saturdays also. He was very aware of what was going on in China, even at an early age. He collected information on the Sino-Japanese conflict that was going on and the atrocities that were committed in Nanking. He would see the mutilated bodies and the victims of the Japanese, and pictures and articles and whatever kind of information he could get his hands on. He was also very aware of Chinese history itself. His mother was a big reader, and when Lee would request it, she would read out loud what she was perusing through at the time, and it was generally something about Chinese history. And Lee took in particular to the period of the Three Kingdoms, the Han Dynasty, and just the famous generals that came out of that. All kinds of rich history that came from China, period, but during that time, they've got a lot of interesting stories. And so he took to these very early on, very early age, very dedicated to his learnings, and especially the military aspect of it, which will come into play later in life. So Lee joined the Marines shortly before the end of World War II. When he said why he chose the Marines, it was because he wanted to put aside the stigma as the meek Chinese individual or Chinese American that just wasn't up, because they didn't fit the stereotype of you see from Marines back in the day, even nowadays, as the crayon eating knuckle draggers. So Lee kind of wanted to remove the stereotype of the Chinese not being tough, and so he decided to join the Marines. Initially, he was assigned the task of learning the Japanese language, and so he was to stay on as a class instructor, which was very disappointing to Lee because he wanted to do the militaristic combat aspect of it all, the field aspects of war, if you will. But the Second World War ended before Lee could even see any real combat, and so he re-enlisted shortly before the Korean War and was commissioned as an officer in April of 1946. So he was in the basic school with a lot of other Pacific veterans, the Pacific campaigns, if you will, and so he had a lot of exposure to people who had direct conflict with the Japanese, and good teachers to have around anybody who's actually been through combat. Sadly, when Lee was in the Marines, he didn't keep in touch with his family. He was a very big family man, but when he was in the Marines, he wanted to focus predominantly on the Marines. And so he kind of lost touch with his family, or chose not to keep in touch with them. He actually ended up getting married and not even inform his family about it until much later on. They weren't at his wedding. They didn't know that he was commissioned an officer He just kind of kept this information to himself, but his family still loved and honored Lee, and wanted the best for him. His first commission was temporary. It was at Camp Lejeune, the one that you hear all those commercials for, about how if you drink the water, you're probably got cancer. And then from there, he went to Beiping. And you'd think in this time that his education in the Chinese language would have been a benefit to him, but they spoke Mandarin, not Cantonese. So, and this actually ended up being a detriment to Lee because he didn't speak Mandarin and he wouldn't speak Cantonese to them. So they would see this, obvious Asian man dressed in a American uniform, and he would refuse to speak to them in their language. Well, not refuse, he just didn't speak it, but that's how they saw it. Like, this guy's too good to speak to us in our own language. So it ended up being a detriment to him more than anything. And from there, from Beiping, he went straight to Guam, and then he went back to California, where he spent the rest of his time at a shipyard, and this is where he made his first lieutenant. But shortly after this, the Korean War breaks out, and he's only given several weeks to prepare, essentially the time that it takes to travel on a ship to Korea. And on the ship, he did something that wasn't normal. He drilled his men on tactics and how to disassemble and reassemble your machine gun. Just things that most people weren't doing. Most people were just shooting cars, gambling, smoking cigarettes. So this stood out. He stood out in this regard. Lee's unit was so they get to Incheon. They're the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines, which is a reserve unit that landed at Incheon, which is a port city west of Seoul. And his company's first exposure to combat was in Seoul, and it was street fighting, and they were trying to retake the city and push the North Koreans back up north. When questioned for a video that was made as part of the Library of Congress, Lee said their real goal was to destroy the enemy, because if you push an enemy out of a city and you push them back up into their territory, they're just going to rearm, reorganize, and then come back down and be a nuisance all over again. And so all this takes place between September to October, shortly before the Battle of the Cheosan Reservoir. Now, the Cheosan Reservoir is a man-made lake. It's in northeast North Korea, if you will. It's still there if you want to Google Earth it. The name Chosen is actually a Japanese name, and the reason they use Chosen or the Japanese name is because the UN forces and the Americans were using Japanese maps. They're outdated, older Japanese maps, and they called it Chosen. The real name in Korean is like Chonjing or something like that. I've never really been good with Korean, but it's Chonjing. And the main focus of this battle was a road that led to a port city called Hungnam. Yeah, and so it's a gravel road at best. Just picture like a really crappy road, and it's got gravel in some spots, and those are the good spots. That's the road. But Hungnam was a port city, and it was an important city and an important road that they needed. So that's kind of why the battle even took place, was because of this road. The battle, it's one of those, you look back on a lot of battles of history and they'll go, usually it's not that crappy in this place, but for some reason on this day, it was just as crappy as it could be. And that's exactly what happened here. There was a front from Siberia that was blowing in, and it was making it about negative 36 degrees Fahrenheit. And so everything was either frozen or freezing. Even the gun oil would gel up. Blood plasma would freeze. If you cut away clothes to address a wound or see if somebody was wounded worse, it would cause frostbite. Gangrene was a big problem. Batteries and radios would stop working. They, of course, the Jeeps wouldn't work. gun lubricants would gel, and then it was so cold that the firing pins wouldn't always strike with enough force to get bullets to produce the firing pin to engage and get to fire. And so a lot of this battle came from a book called Colder Than Hell by Joseph R. Owen. And Owen does a really good account of the battle. He was there. He was a lieutenant there. It's a pretty good book. It picks up really quickly and goes straight into combat. I had some issue with it because his story and Lee's stories conflicted, and not in the same way where like you have two guys and they remember a battle completely differently. Like this guy was over here, and then this guy was like 20 yards away, and they had two different views on what was going on in the battle. No, like Owens fills gaps in certain parts of it, and you're just kind of listening to the man himself, Lee, talk, and he has a different explanation of what happened than Owens, because Owens just filling in details, which he's gone, so what are you going to do about it? Argue with him about it? But in the book, he demonstrates that Lee did know his stuff, did know what he was talking about, and it quickly dawned on the men that Lee was the real deal. So this is from Owen's book Colder Than Hell. This is a machine gunner named Charlie Baldwin. He's having an issue with the machine gun, so Charlie Baldwin's machine gun kicked up a cloud of dust every time it went off, and the dust drew enemy fire. Baldwin wanted to move the gun, but he didn't think he should do so without orders from his squad leader, who was engaged elsewhere on the hill. Lieutenant Lee came upon Baldwin's gun. "Sir, I think we should move this gun," Baldwin said to the lieutenant. "It's kicking up dust." "You have a good position here, Baldwin," Lieutenant Lee responded. "I'll show you how to handle the dust problem." Lee opened his canteen and walked around the machine gun, sprinkling precious water as he went. "Now fire off a burst," ordered Lee. The machine gun fired, but raised no dust. Lieutenant Lee walked on up the hill, ignoring the enemy bullets. Charlie Baldwin was impressed with his lieutenant's calm. End quote. Lee knew his tactics. Nobody else was doing this, and Lee wasn't even exposed to like regular combat. So this isn't like something that he learned because he had to sprinkle his on. There was a scene, what was it, We Were Soldiers, where Mel Gibson's character does this. He pees on like a mortar team's firing, and he pees around it instead of wasting water. It's because he had experience with that before. Lee had never experienced anything like this. Lee was just by the book. He was just a guy who had read the tactics, knew what he was talking about, and drilled his men on it. So that it shows. It showed to his men very early on in the battle that not only was this a guy who's going to expose himself to fire, isn't going to run and hide, isn't going to cower on the ground, but he knows what he's talking about. And so this is from the same book, Colder Than Hell, and it's in the same battle. And this is a guy who, by the name of Bifolk, is a machine gunner. Bifolk knew he should keep moving, and as he looked for the next safe spot, he saw Lieutenant Lee walking up the hill through the thick enemy fire. Bullets scraped the ground, and a mortar round exploded so close that its concussion staggered him, but Lee kept walking. "Hey, Lee! We're getting shot at!" Bifolk had Lieutenant Lee's attention. The lieutenant dashed to where Bifolk was hugging the ground. "You address me as Lee?" he said, standing over the astonished young Marine. "Jesus, yeah, get down, you're drawing fire." "You, on your feet," demanded Lee. Bullets zipped through the air, punctuating the bizarre scene of a lieutenant bracing a PFC to attention in the midst of a firefight. "You call me Lieutenant Lee, or sir, you understand that, Marine?" Yes, sir, stammered Bifolk, wishing that he were in a very deep foxhole. "And you never forget that, you understand? Now carry on," said the lieutenant, and he proceeded to walk farther up the hill, seemingly oblivious to the enemy fire. "What the hell?" thought PFC Bifolk, and he got up and walked behind Lee. The rest of the mortar squad arose and followed Bifolk. End quote. There's something about this scene that I liked in particular, because one, I don't agree with the whole bracing somebody to attention in the middle of a firefight, but I'm not Lee. But he's not going to be even a fraction of disrespected in this situation, because to Lee, it's no different than any other situation. It's no different than you addressing him at PT. It's no different than you addressing him in the chow hall. It's a standard across the board. You address me as Lieutenant Lee or sir. Do you understand? It doesn't matter that there's bullets going by. It doesn't matter that you're hugging the ground because you're afraid to get hit. He's telling you you're addressing him as sir. And so you do it. And then his calm demeanor as he walks on, carries on up the hill, the rest of the men see this, and it's just contagious. They're just like, well, I mean, what the hell? I mean, we'll follow him. You know, so they go up the hill, and it's one of the things that it's just a little event to us, but to the men in the situation, it's something a whole lot more. Like you're scared. You're away from home, you're away from everything you know, away from everybody you know, these guys that you've just made friends with, you're very close, but this guy is showing you a stability and a calm demeanor that is practically, like I said, contagious. Did I say that? Either way, contagious. And so, that's something that, the fearlessness, he's seemingly impervious to bullets, and it's something that really shines through. He didn't order his men, you know, go out into enemy fire, walk out into these bullets. He went and did it. And the men were like, oh, I'm not going to be shamed into sitting here in a hole. So they followed their lieutenant. So this is another example. Lee at the time was wearing, so like they would have these pink paneling, these essentially something very bright in color for people in aviation to see, like helicopters or planes. And Lee took a piece of it off and wrapped it around, I think, his arm. And it was so his men could tell Lee from everybody else at night or in a firefight or in any other situation. It's ballsy, it's brave, and it's borderline foolish, because if you're on the enemy side and you're just shooting at what you can't really make out, if you see like a guy with bright pink on his arm, it's easier to see and shoot. You know, like this is a segue, but when they originally found out that zebras camouflage is meant to blend in with the herd, it was when researchers were trying to keep track of zebras, but they kept losing them. They kept like not being able to tell which one was which, so they would mark one of the zebras with like a red piece of paint or something, some kind of marker on the zebra so they could spot it. Well, it ended up not working, because when they would mark that one zebra, predators would be able to mark that zebra too. They would be like, well, this zebra, they could select it out because it had one mark on it, and they could focus on it and they would kill it. I believe I'm recounting that story accurately. Don't at me on that. I'm just going off memory from a story I read about. But so Lee is marking himself in an attempt to get his men to be able to see him at all times. And so during this night attack, the Chinese come, and Lee and his men reacted. And so they're being shot at, and nobody's returning fire because they can't see who they're shooting at. But Lee starts telling his men, aim for the muzzle flashes. Aim for the muzzle flashes from their gun. Just aim at those muzzle flashes and start shooting. And so they do. And Lee ends up by himself, single-handedly, advancing on the enemy positions to draw their fire. And he begins shouting in Mandarin Chinese and throwing hand grenades, and all of this going on is creating confusion to the troops. They're being yelled at in their own language. They got this grenades coming in. They got fire coming in on them. And so eventually they end up retreating. And, it's a successful attack. It's a bad situation, being attacked at night. And not because they weren't returning fire. The Marines they didn't know what to shoot at. And Lee's like, just shoot at these muzzle flashes, I'll take care of the rest. And so they do end up putting enough heat on them. And then Lee's grenades, and then the confusion of the The yelling at them in their own language. Well, I wasn't going to mention this. So, in the Pacific Theater, there was an issue, a minor issue, but it's noted in several books that I read. One of the Bataan Death March, I think they talk about it. Or am I cross-pollinating them? Either way, there was a number of Japanese officers who studied in American colleges. So they would speak English almost, like when they wanted to, almost without an accent. And by that, I mean, you could say like brief phrases real quick, perfectly. You know, they might not speak a perfect American without English, perfect English without an accent, but they could speak enough of it in the brief phrases like "Charlie platoon, get down" or something like that. And so the men they'd be marching through these jungles or through these like paths in the jungle, and then suddenly, you know, officer would be sitting there and all of his men would be on the ground, and he'd be going, "What are y'all doing on the ground? What the hell's going on, sir? You told us to get down." I was like, "No, I didn't. Yeah, somebody yelled, 'Charlie Company, get down.'" And so it was Japanese officers sowing confusion by yelling in English to confuse us. Well, you see this right here. This is what Lee's doing. It's, you know, for once, it's flipped because you have a Chinese American, well, you know, of Chinese heritage, but an American, and he's yelling in their language to, you know, sow confusion, and it works. You know, it worked beautifully, and it ended up repelling the attack, making a bad situation that much better, purely because of his understanding of tactics, the way he leads his men, and the fact that he speaks their language, and he's ballsy as hell. So during this battle, Lee was shot. No, not during the battle. The next morning, Lee was shot by a sniper in his elbow, and it ended up doing some damage, and he was evacuated to a MASH unit or a field hospital. And his actions that day did earn him the Navy Cross, so that his actions didn't go without notice. He was eventually given the Navy Cross, which is the second highest honor for combat bravery. Yeah, I think so. So Lee's hospitalized for less than a week when he learns that they're going to send him to Japan to finish out his recovery. And he's not having that. He's not going to be taken out of the fight that easily. So Lee begins... Now this part's from Owen's book, so I don't know if it's 100% true. But regardless, Lee begins asking other people around, you know, "Hey, I'm heading to the Chosin Reservoir. Who's coming with me?" And he only ends up getting one taker, and that's Staff Sergeant Keller. Yeah. So him and Keller end up commandeering a Jeep, and they steal a Jeep, and they think they're being pursued while they get in this Jeep, and they're going essentially down unknown roads. It's not lit, you know, it's not like they have lights there. Neither of these men really know the road. They have a compass in a direction that they want to go, which is towards the reservoir. And so they look behind them, and it looks like two vehicles are giving chase. And they're just going as fast as these old Jeeps can go, which is not fast. Even like whole military vehicle. You ever been in a Humvee and floored it? They're just not fast. It's just, I don't know. I don't get the appeal of wanting them in the civilian sector. But either way. So they're going about as fast as a Jeep can go. And Lee's yelling, "Floor it, floor it, floor it." Keller's going, I'm going, sir. I'm flooring it. And then in the road up ahead, a hairpin turn. You know, there's rice paddies all over the place in Korea. So it's like a ditch to, you know, for an irrigation ditch, drop off. Hairpin turn, they're airborne, in the air. And Lee thinks, for a brief moment, "Oh my God, I've done all this that I can do. I've, you know, defied all these stereotypes. Come on to be this soldier that I am, and I'm going to die ignominiously in a car crash." Patton died, isn't it? Either way. But Lee doesn't want to go out that way. They end up landing, somehow, they land on that Jeep, or in the Jeep, and neither of them are hurt. You know, they start laughing. They burst out laughing. And then the vehicles they thought were chasing them, they weren't chasing them. They're just responding to something. Because in Owen's book, he makes the scene sound like a scene from a movie, and the book is worth getting if you want to watch or if you want to read the book. It's entertaining, but this scene's completely different. Like, what I'm telling you now is what Lee said happened, and what Owens has in his book is this like scene from a movie where Lee gets out with a gun and levels it off to these waiting soldiers, and they end up getting chased and offering them a ride because their Jeep's totaled. But Lee says the Jeep doesn't get totaled. It works well enough to get them close enough to the chosen reservoir, and I think they walk the rest or something. But either way, they get back to the chosen reservoir and they're fine. Lee's arm's still in a sling, probably for the rest of this, for the battle, I believe. So they get back, separate, obviously, because that's not part of his unit. But Lee goes back to his men. Nobody really questions it. The battalion commander sees Lee with a sling, and he's like, whatever, we need men. And so there's the Battle of Fox Hill. And this is where Lee earns his Silver Star. This is, shameful. The military was so unprepared for this attack, the higher ups, the brass in this situation. Lee's chosen as point man, and it's a blizzard. These are blizzard conditions. And Lee believes that his commander chose him because he had faith in him. There's nothing I've read to dispel otherwise. He was respected by his battalion commander because he was the real deal. And, you can't be picky in a lot of these situations. So even if he was prejudiced against him or discriminating against him or whatever ist word we want to use, the guy delivered. Lee delivered. So Lee, with his bright pink fucking paneling on, his arm in a sling. He's got arm in a sling, rifle in the other hand, and he got the compass in the sling arm. And he's at the head of a column. And the reason it's a column is because the terrain is too treacherous and for them to spread out. So Lee's the point man at the front of this column, and there's signal flares going off at 3-minute intervals. And that's supposed to be their light. But Lee said that this ended up working against them because you'll get used to the way things are in the darkness. Just picture, so when you go to the bathroom at night in a blizzard, when you go to the bathroom at night and you flip the light on and then you turn it back off and your night vision's completely gone. Like that vision that you had when you got up and went to the bathroom, your eyes, that's what was happening to them every 3 minutes. So they would kind of get their bearing, get where they're going, and start moving, and then a signal flare would go up, and Lee was like, I could hardly see anything. It was too much light when it was light, and then when it finally went away, you get your night vision back. But luckily, the military is terrible at planning these kind of things, and so the signal flares ended up stopping. And so Lee was left to do all this by compass. So him and his men, and in Owen's book, he doesn't understand why Lee stops. Lee ends up stopping the column. And the reason that he stops the column is because they can't see where they're going, and it's blizzard conditions. So there's snow all in front of them. So him and the scouts that are up front with him are literally having to poke and prod with their weapons and their feet to make sure they're not walking off a cliff or walking into crazy terrain. And so that was what ends up taking a really long time. And each one of these men is carrying over 100 pounds of gear. It's a double load of ammo, all the gear they have, their cold weather gear, right? The gear that keeps them a little bit warmer. And Lee said that when he got to Japan, he weighed about 118 pounds. So let's put Lee at about 120 pounds right now. 118, 120. He was 130 when he went in. And so that's a lot of gear. And you can't move your feet around. You have to be quiet. When you get really cold, you kind of stomp to get blood flow going. You move around to get blood flow going. They can't do that. They just have to sit there and suck it up. But Lee ends up calling a halt to the march at about 2 o'clock. So they set off at about 9. And then at 2, they halt the march for several hours. and then they wait until daybreak to start advancing again. And so 3 hours later, it's daybreak, and during this time, Lee's given no further instruction, no further guidance. It's all the original, hey, lead this column in, take this hill. You know, usually you get something else. And it was poorly planned, and a brief reason why it's poorly planned, like just the most glaringly obvious one, is there was no reconnaissance done. They didn't know what they were walking into. You know, it could have been like 2 battalions worth of men. They didn't know. They could have been well fortified positions. They really had no idea. So they're going in, compass, in a blizzard, negative 36 degrees Fahrenheit, and just sudden cliffs and drop-offs and just painful frostbite, freezing, and Lee's at the head of this column. And eventually, once they start moving again at daybreak, they get fired upon. The front of their column gets fired upon. So they're taking heavy enemy fire. They're up in an elevated position, you know, with the Anakin Skywalker Obi-Wan meme, I got the high ground. Well, they have the high ground. But Lee ain't no Anakin. He ain't getting his legs cut off. So what he ends up doing is forming his men into a skirmish line. And the men form up and start doing a marching fire, which you don't really ever see. I mean, they did it back in World War II. But so essentially, they're marching uphill towards the enemy in their positions, firing down on them. And they're firing back and marching towards them. And Lee said at a certain point, the men just, you know, they know what to do, attack. Kill the enemy, drive them off this hill. So, marching fire up the hill, and then the men just start whooping and hollering and yelling their whatever kind of crazy chant they have from back home. And Lee said that he had never been more proud of his men. They rushed the hill, pushed the enemy out, rout them. They end up fleeing off this hill, and the men end up taking it. And against all odds, this poorly planned mission in a blizzard, you know, point man with his arm in a sling and a compass to guide him at night, and they end up leading a successful attack on an enemy with the high ground, firing down on them, and they end up routing the enemy. That's pretty impressive. That's pretty damn impressive. Because, well, there's tons of reasons why. You know, there's just tons of reasons why they shouldn't have gone their way. And it was like, no, you almost have leadership working against you in this situation. Like, you almost have, you know, like, hey, here's the rough idea, what we want to do. Have fun. See you later. Have fun. And let us know how it goes. So Lee ends up, this is sort of drawing towards the close of his time there in Korea. He ends up getting promoted to company commander, you know, a captain's rank. He gets the, you know, it's still his rank, but he ends up getting the responsibilities hoisted upon him when their commander dies. And this is for all of about 15 minutes, according to him. Because shortly after he gets promoted to this position, he's trying to communicate with a tank. And when you communicate with these tanks, you wouldn't like open the hatch or knock on it, ask them. There's like a phone or a radio on the outside. I can't remember. There's like some sort of comm system where you're like, hey, fire around that hill, and they're like, roger that. And so he's using this system to tell the tank, hey, we need you to fire on this or whatever. And while it's going on, he ends up getting hit by machine gun fire. And so he's fine. I mean, well, you know, anything less than a direct missile attack on this guy is not going to really do anything. He ends up walking himself down to an aid station, but at the aid station, they're like, dude, you're on a stretcher. So they put him on a stretcher, and then they evacuate him to Japan. Some C-54 ends up picking him up and taking him to Japan, and he spends some time there recovering before he's eventually sent back to the States. where he fully regains the use of his arm. Eventually, they consider him fit for duty, and they put him on a recon company, but they like take him out of the field essentially. They put him on a recon company, give him a command position there, and that's where he spends the rest of that war. After that, he does spend some time in South Vietnam. Again, not in like a battlefield position. He's at division level, and he ends up spending some time there. He does do some time training people at the basic school. I believe that's where it is. He does do some training, but eventually he ends up retiring in 1968. And he retired at the rank of major. Goes on to work for an insurance company and a couple other jobs. He was married twice, produced no children. Sadly, this man, this badass, lived and died without producing any children. And so that's a shame. We could have used more Lees. Lees like him. I don't know, either way. Treated differently. He says he was treated differently. Obviously he was. He was of Asian American heritage, so he was treated differently. He ended up having to earn all the respect he earned. He earned it the hard way. From all appearances and from what I've read, most people realized Lee was the real deal pretty early on. Even when you listen to him, like on the Library of Congress video, is pretty informative. He sounds like an old Marine. He's got that. Sorry, I can't do that. He's got this old gruff man voice. He sounds like a stereotypical Marine. Like he's just got that rough voice and rough demeanor and no BS. He's the real deal. And it probably came off that way to the men that he was working with. And just like the examples that I read off, and there's more examples in Colder Than Hell. I really recommend the book. Joseph R. Owen, Colder Than Hell is what it's called. It's a pretty good book. It's not very long. I think I got the audible version, and the narrator, I listened to it at like 1.2 or something, 1.1. Not every narrator is the best on there. This guy, I usually don't have complaints about the narrator, but this guy for some reason took me out of it. I didn't really care for his narration, but it's a fine book. If you want to read it yourself, I bet you're probably a better narrator. So he was awarded the Navy Cross and the Silver Star for the events on the Fox Hill, the battle with the Marching Fire and leading the compass at night. That he very decorated on his way out. And as I mentioned, Owen's book, he does a good job. Obviously written after the fact. I mean, how could you write a book before? That'd be kind of weird. But he fills details that I don't think he should fill. Like if you don't have anything to say on it, just don't say anything on it. Just why would you make up something that happened and then use like the Library of Congress video where Lee's like talking about that video or the book and that didn't happen. This is what actually happened. You're going, well, that's a far more entertaining story. Maybe he didn't know it. So his video interview with the Library of Congress is like 2 hours and some change. I recommend it if you're sitting around one day bored, it's pretty informative. The interviewer, maybe I'm just being critical to everybody right now, but the interviewer I didn't really care for. I felt like he kind of asked dumb questions at certain points. But what are you gonna do? He got a good interview out of him, and Lee makes the best of it. So Owen's information was presented, I believe, in good faith. It's also very entertaining, but ultimately, just read the book, get it for yourself. It's actually not that bad. But that's the life of Kurt Chew-Een Lee. His brother, I didn't mention his brother. His brother also served in the Army and ended up meeting Lee while they were stationed in Korea. I didn't mention it because I got conflicting versions of the story, and then when I heard Lee's, it wasn't very eventful. They just met each other while they were there, and he gave them like these banana mags or like 2 magazines taped together. That happened early on, and that comes into play into the story with Lee, but I didn't feel like it really warranted needing to go into. But other than that, he had a pretty eventful life and somebody you don't normally hear about. And that's kind of what my aim is to do with this if I ever... I mean, I'm pretty sure I'm going to make another video on Jerry Mad Dog Shriver. I think that's who I'm going to do next. But this isn't just going to be like military guys. It's just a lot of these stories that I'm focusing on are stories that I found very interesting that I'd never really heard about. Like the James Floyd one and then Kurt Chew-Een Lee. I'd never really heard about Lee either. You know, you'd think you have like Asian American Heritage Month, you know, these months for people, but I'd never heard about Lee during them. Maybe I'm just not doing enough research for these events. I mean, hell, there could have been a commercial for it. I don't really watch TV, so. But either way, he's a pretty interesting guy, lived a pretty interesting life, and I just figured that, hell, if you get anything out of this, it's a little more information about people who lived in your own country. All right, that's all I got.